So my name is Mark Henry, and I'm joined by my fellow practice leader of Citrin Cooperman's Manufacturing and Distribution Group, John Giordano. We're proud to have Dr. Anirban Basu back with us again to give his insights on the economy and specifically the results that came out of our newly issued Manufacturing and Distribution Survey. If you've been with us before, you know Dr. Basu is an incredible way of keeping us engaged and laughing on very important economic issues. Dr. Basu is chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group, a Baltimore-based economic and policy consultancy firm, which he founded in 2004. He serves the chief economic function for many organizations, and in 2022, he entered the Daily Record newspaper's Circle of Influence. He's the distinguished economist in residence at Kucher College, where he teaches history of economic thought. He holds 4 graduate degrees, including a JD and a PhD, and we're very happy to have him joining us again. Dr. Basu, thank you for joining us.
Righto. Thank you very much for having me, Citrin Cooperman. Let's get started. And so I'm glad that many of you were able to hang around and stick around and so on and so forth. And I think you'll find that your wait was well worth it, not because of me, as it turns out, but because the data are really interesting from this manufacturing distribution pulse survey report. So let me get right into it. This is, of course, an economist perspective, as I'm an economist. Please hold any further applause. But it's about the data first and foremost. And so let me go through first some major findings. And I'll tell you something. We economists have been talking about the likelihood of recession for a couple of years now. But based on the performance of the respondents, recession certainly has not been here. And this, really, the results defy gravity. So here's some major findings and themes. I'm going to repeat some of these findings later on in the presentation as I drill down into some of the data. But let me just go through this. Revenue and earnings grow in the face of inflationary pressures. Why is that important? Because your costs have gone up, whether wage pressures or cost of inputs, so on and so forth. But you've had the pricing power, apparently, to offset that, to drive EBITDA higher. More than 90% of companies say revenues and EBITDA grew last year. That's 90%. In 2021, it was about 80%. So 9 in 10 say, their EBITDA grew. So it's one thing for revenues to grow in an inflationary environment. You might expect that revenues would grow because you're charging more. But EBITDA grew, which means that that revenue growth exceeded cost growth. Product performance continues to improve. More than 8 in 10, or 82% of respondents, said products are performing at least somewhat better in 2022 compared to 2021. It was up from 75% in the previous survey. E-commerce is still expanding, and it was not simply a pandemic-era phenomenon. Online sales account for 51 to 75% of total sales for more than half of you, or at least half of all companies surveyed. That was up from 43% last year. Biggest challenge remains supply chain. You're going to see in the data some improvements in supply chain dynamics. However, 38% of respondents say that their company's biggest challenge today is supply chain. And that was also the number one factor in the previous survey. Rising inflation at 35% and interest rates, 30%, were also challenging factors in 2022. More uptake of artificial intelligence and machine learning. 37% of respondents have now fully implemented data analytics tools and processes. Process automation, 74%, and cognitive insights, 66%, are top methods of AI or machine learning being used by companies. And stability needed for growth. 43% of respondents said that stabilization of supply chain is the biggest key to their company's future growth strategy. So the supply chain is improved, it's still a problem. This was followed closely by utilizing best-in-class technology, 37%, and a stable workforce, 31%. Again, you'll see some of these numbers again as I drill down. So again, revenue and earnings continue to grow. The bars on the left-hand side of the slide, that's revenues. The bars on the right-hand side of the slide, that's EBITDA, earnings before interest. The gray colored bars are data from the 2021 survey. The mustard colored bars in the middle are from the 2022 survey, and the data in which we have most interest, the 2023 survey, that's in green. So you can see 66% of companies generated some or modest growth in revenues, 27% significant growth. But that means 92, 93% said, hey, we grew revenues. Now, with respect to EBITDA, 67% saw some modest growth in EBITDA, 25% said significant growth. That's 92%. So 9 in 10 firms, a year of progress in 2022, despite all that inflation and lingering supply chain issues, E-commerce continues to expand. So in the 2023 survey, more than half of respondents were in the 51 to 75% online sales category. In other words, if you look at the third set of bars there, 54% said that a majority, 51 to 75% of their sales were online in their retail and distribution activities. 6% said more than 75%. So again, this is not simply a pandemic era phenomenon. This online sales continues, the sales channel continues to expand. If you look at the note at the very bottom of the slide, 25% of respondents saw e-commerce double or more over the past 12 months. That's how remarkable this transformation continues to be. 60% saw e-commerce increase significantly, but not double. Product performance continues to improve. Again, there's just good news here. And, for us economists who are members of the dismal science, we actually like bad news. That's who we are. We suffer, we want others to suffer. But in fact, you appear not to be suffering. So if you look at the green color bars on the right-hand side of the slide, products tended to perform much better in 2022 compared to 2021, 27%, much better performance for products. Products tended to perform somewhat better in 2022 compared to 2021, 55%. So do the math on that. That's 82% said we were better in terms of product performance in 2022 than in 2021. Another 16% said it was about the same. So almost everyone was the same in terms of product performance or better. Now, there were a handful of people who said products tended to perform worse in 2021. We, of course, have a diverse set of manufacturer and distribution respondents to the survey. Nonetheless, this speaks to very strong demand for goods, very strong demand at the wholesale level, also at the manufacturing level. Biggest challenges for supply, supply chain and rising inflation. So the survey question went thusly: from the following list, what is your company's biggest challenge today? You can select your top 3 choices. The most prominent selection was supply chain. Yes, things have improved, though you might notice that at the Port of Los Angeles, they're once again having issues with labor, rising inflation, rising interest rates. And yes, that's one of the big deltas between 2021 and 2022. I just want to take a step back and point out how remarkable this is. That 2022 was meaningfully better than 2021. A couple of things here to consider. One, 2021 was a year of bounce back for the economy because we reopened the economy. So a lot of that reopening effect showed up in 2021. You might have expected 2022 to have brought forth, less fabulous activity. That's one. Second, war broke out in Ukraine on February 24th of 2022. Oil and natural gas prices skyrocketed. We were worried about recession in Europe, recession in North America, and a very cold winter in Europe. And then a month later, in March of 2022, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States began raising interest rates at the fastest pace in more than 4 decades. So, given those events, one might have thought, my goodness, 2022 is setting up to be a bit of a disappointing year relative to 2021, the reopening year for the economy. Instead, no, yes, rising interest rates is a challenge, but many of you continue to say, despite higher cost of capital, my revenues grew and my EBITDA grew. Now, there's some other challenges down below that are of interest, of course. Ability for workforce to embrace and utilize changing technologies. We'll come back to that later on, 27%. Competitors' buying power. Yeah, it is often said by people that, I love competition. Have you heard this before? I love competition because it brings out the best in me. I'm a small business owner myself, and I got to tell you, I hate competition. When I go to sleep at night, I pray for a few things. I pray for the well-being of my family, friends, the broader society. I pray for the Orioles young pitching staff, but mostly I pray for my competitors to die, preferably violently. Dismemberment is perfectly okay with me. And so, of course, competitors, lots of merger acquisition activity. Competitors are, in some cases, are very, very large. They have buying power. They can buy inputs at lower prices and then pass that along, that cost savings to customers, underpricing maybe smaller competitors. So I think that's the issue there. Ability to finance growth. Well, of course, cost of capital is up. E-commerce pressure, loss of market share to competitors like Amazon. Managing cash flow, inability to retain and attract adequate talent, so on and so forth. Lots of stuff going on here. At the very bottom, interestingly, implementation of environment, social, and government or governance strategy, ESG. So that's out there as well. So, I mean, let's go a little bit deeper into some of these major challenges. Let's first talk about supply chain and inflation. So, again, supply chain continues to be a problem. I was speaking to a group of mechanical contractors out of Washington, D.C. recently, and they said to me that their lead time for switchgear was in the range of 50, 60, 70, sometimes 100 weeks. Their lead time for generators or something akin to that. So these supply chain issues, the economists don't talk as much about them as they once did, are still persist. So in which of the following ways have you changed your supply chain? So I'm looking for the left of the slide here, the green colored bars, more diversification of suppliers. But that works both ways, doesn't it? So you might be looking at additional suppliers. So your traditional supplier said, I don't have it. I don't have it in my inventory. I'm so sorry. Well, naturally, you're going to go look for someplace else. But the same thing can happen to you as a supplier. I don't have it in my inventory, and you know that your customer might turn elsewhere when they haven't before. So we continue to see diversification of suppliers. Reshoring to the United States. Oh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? You know, we have about $250 billion of computer chip manufacturing plants under development in this country. You know, so I mean, that's one prominent example, but supply chain is coming back. And at the same time, you see 52% outsourcing their manufacturing. That's interesting. Well, I think those things fit actually. Because what might be happening is that because more supply chain is coming back to America, there's more opportunity for people to outsource their manufacturing to domestic producers. Now, it's conceivable that they're outsourcing to non-domestic producers as well. That's not clear from the survey data. Nonetheless, more supply chain is coming back to America. And so if I go to the right side of the slide here, 72% of companies surveyed said they have changed how a product is sourced due to global supply chain disruptions. 80% are diversified suppliers, 53% are reshoring to the US, 52% are looking to outsource manufacturing compared to 49% the previous year. What about positive product performance? Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing. You know, I celebrated my 27th anniversary yesterday with my wife. I didn't feel that celebratory, so I need to figure out what that means for me. But setting that aside, my wife, I might have complaints about her, but I think she's improving, and hopefully she's saying something similar about me. And that's the same thing with the supply chain. The supply chain is problematic, but it's still improving. So if you look at the right of the slide here, primary reason that there was a positive change in product performance, improvements in supply chain, 27%. So it got less worse, is the point here. Improvement in demand for product, 19%. That wasn't really driven so much by demand, therefore. The economy has been growing, of course, or at least, for much of 2022, it grew. But a lot of the improvement is on the supply side. You're driving the improvement. It's not necessarily your external environment is necessarily improving in terms of demand that much. It's that you are taking steps as suppliers to deal with your costs, to pick new suppliers, so on and so forth. Introduce a new product line down below, 14%. The presence of Amazon and other e-commerce platforms, 13%. Ability to pass on inflation, inventory supply costs, 10%. What does that mean? Pricing power. That a lot of you continue to report significant pricing power at the same time that certain costs are declining. This is your Baltic Dry Index. It's a reflection of global shipping costs for raw materials, things like metals, grains, and fossil fuels by sea. So this is shipping costs. I have followed the Baltic Dry Index as a leading indicator of the global economy for decades, as it turns out. And ever since I was a very, very young economist, in fact, when I was a single man in my 20s, I would often introduce the Baltic Dry Index in my conversation with young women in an attempt to garner interest. And it might surprise you to learn that very little interest was garnered. But in any case, this is a leading indicator of the global economy. And the notion is that if shipping costs are high for shipping raw materials, then that's a good sign for the global economy, because it means that those raw materials are being transported, and ultimately that raw material shipment translates into output growth globally. Conversely, if shipping costs are falling, typically that's seen as a bad sign for global economic growth, because the ships are pretty empty, that means, and therefore shipping costs are falling for those raw materials. And what you see here, you can see that shipping costs are falling, have been falling. And the global economy, in fact, has been weakening and is expected to weaken further still. More on that later in the presentation. But from the perspective of a purchaser of shipping as a service, certainly the fact that shipping costs are falling is a positive, as that savings that can be passed along through the supply chain. Inflation. I thought this was a very interesting part of the survey as well. Almost 2/3 of respondents, 64%, experienced an increase in inventory prices over the last 12 months. Almost 100% of respondents report passing production and supply chain costs through to customers via raising prices. That's interesting, because that means that the customer is still willing to take on higher prices. And it speaks to an economy that's still pretty strong. So again, all this talk about recession, but the demand is still strong enough to support price increases and therefore EBITDA growth. Companies are passing costs through to customers more frequently as well. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. 71% of respondents anticipate that the cost of inventory will be higher in the next 12 months. That's interesting, because more than 2 and 3 of our respondents are saying that they anticipate that further cost increases. The inflation is not going to go away, despite the Federal Reserve's best efforts. The Federal Reserve, as you know, has raised rates for the last 10 consecutive meetings, driving the upper limit on the Fed funds rate that target interest rate from 0.25% to 5.25%. Again, in an effort to try to combat excess inflation. Nonetheless, many of you expect inflation pressures to persist. That said, if you look at the macroeconomic as opposed to the survey data, we see something a bit different. This is the producer price index for all manufacturing industries. This reflects the price changes at the wholesale level for manufactured items. And what it says is that since February of 2020, which was the last month before the shutdown of the economy, wholesale prices are up 26.6% for manufactured goods, but over the past year are down 0.3%. So we are starting to see some disinflation and deflation. And indeed, if you look at the Purchasing Managers Index, for instance, from the Institute for Supply Management, the latest reading there for May 31st was 46.9, which is less than 50, which means that manufacturing is now in its own recession, at least according to that indicator. So what is interesting to me is that there is so much upbeat information here about pricing power, and we'll talk more about your projections of your own future in a moment, but there's a lot of optimism here in the survey data. And yet, when you look at the macroeconomic data and some of these leading indicators, like, again, the Purchasing Managers Index, it's not so optimistic. Now, one of the other things, of course, that firms are doing is managing their costs. It's obviously finding new channels through which to sell product is important, but obviously cost containment is another. So which of the following ways in which you're managing your cost of products, let all that apply? Raising sales prices 58%. You're raising your prices. And I think as far as I can tell from the data, and we'll talk more about this, you expect to continue to raise your prices. Relocating sourcing closer to consumers. Well, again, that's about supply chain. That's about reshoring to a certain extent. Outsourcing more manufacturing to third parties. We've talked about that. Renegotiating forward contracts for purchases. Hedging. You want to know what you're going to pay for inputs, for instance. So many of you are becoming and have been very sophisticated with respect to futures contracts and hedging against future price increases. Manufacturing more products ourselves. If you want it done right, do it yourself. And more of you are doing that. Renegotiating freight contracts, which makes sense, of course, because we are starting to see some downward pressure on freight costs in an environment associated, at least according to some measures, manufacturing recession. And so, no surprise, the industry is turning to a certain extent to renegotiating some of those contracts. Companies are passing costs to customers more regularly. There may have been a time when people would change their prices maybe once a year. That's still the case to a certain extent, but no longer necessarily the typical practice. So if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, the bars here, how often are you passing production and supply chain costs to your customers through raising your prices? Monthly, in the 2022 survey, which is the gold colored bars there, 20%. In the 2023 survey, 19%, but very similar. Not statistically significantly different from one year to the next, but about 1 in 5 of you are changing your prices once a month. 65% in the 2023 survey are doing it quarterly. That's the frequency now with which people are changing the price, not once a year, it's once a quarter, 4 times a year. So, and if you look at the bullets on the right-hand side here, almost all companies are passing costs to customers. Companies appear to be passing production prices on to customers more frequently, let's say monthly or quarterly. 84% are passing production and added supply chain costs to their customers through raising prices at least quarterly, up from 74% in the previous survey. So the practices, you can see from the data, more than 4 and 5 are doing it on an at least quarterly basis, adjusting those prices. Okay, let's do a spotlight now, the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think there's some very interesting data here as well. 37% of respondents have now fully implemented data analytics tools and processes, and another 36% are currently implementing data analytics tools and processes. That's what all the popular kids are doing now, folks. They're turning to AI, machine learning. They're turning to the Internet of Things, so on and so forth. Process automation, 74%, and cognitive insight, 66%, are top methods of artificial intelligence or machine learning being used by companies. The top factor for successful implementation is buy-in and support from leadership. Leaders, and you are leaders of your firms, have to buy into the use of AI and machine learning, and more firms are doing this, which means if you're not doing this, you might be falling behind. And of course, you've got to encourage employees to adapt to a digital culture. The most common barriers to implementing or expanding AI or machine learning revolve around quality of data, understanding of cost benefit, and the need for experienced employees. The top benefit of AI or ML, machine learning, is the ability to gather and utilize data from outside the company. Who are your customers? Why are they buying? What are they buying? What prices have they been paying? Is there a way to upsell them? Is there a way to increase the scope of what they're purchasing from you? Complementarities. How is AI being used? How is artificial intelligence or machine learning being utilized by your company? Process automation, 74%. Cognitive insight, 66%. Now, let me define this. What is process automation? Using robotic processes for administrative and financial activities. Process. Cognitive insight, using algorithms to select patterns in data and interpret their meaning. So it could be cognitive insight regarding your customers, but also your own productivity. Cognitive engagement, customer service, intelligence agents, internal sites for employees, product and service recommendation systems. And 9% are not using AI or ML, 9%. Who are you? And why aren't you using AI? And there might be a reason for that. It may simply not be relevant to your business. There's no upside from using it. I mean, just because the cool kids are doing it doesn't mean I have to do it. Fair enough. But if you're not using AI or machine learning, or even if you're using it, but for only a limited set of purposes, I think you should be asking the question actively, what am I missing here? Am I missing something here? Am I missing an opportunity to shave costs? Am I losing an opportunity to learn more about my customers? Or am I losing an opportunity to learn more about my competitors' customers? So what are the success factors and barriers to implementation? So if I look at the left-hand column here, top drivers of successful implementation of data analytics tools and processes, buy-in and support from leadership, we talked about that, encouraging employees, ensuring the appropriate tools are in place, 32%. An effective communication system during and after implementation. So it's a new system. It's artificial intelligence, machine learning. It's not easy. But that said, it's not easy, but a lot of people are doing it. Common barriers to implementing or expanding AI or ML, quality of data in our systems, right? Because what is the learning ground for artificial intelligence? It's your data. That's where it's picking up that's what it's learning from. And if the data are not good data, if they're not accurate data, or they're not sufficiently detailed data, there's a limit to what AI can offer. Understanding of cost benefit, these systems are not cost free. I mean, there's an implementation cost. So, what is my benefit from doing this? I mean, I get it. All the cool kids are doing it, but are they making money doing it? Need experienced employees in AI or ML. And I suspect that, people coming out of college, graduate school right now, specializing in the utilization of artificial intelligence, how to apply the technology or machine learning, are just going to make a fortune. And then integration with existing systems, because there's always that. Applying AI for advantage. So again, how has artificial intelligence or machine learning benefited your company? I think this is important because we're trying to figure out what is the upside here. So 78% say given us the ability to gather and utilize data outside of our company. not about our processes, our production processes, but about our suppliers, our customers, and other outside sources. Who are they? I mean, this is right. When you think about Meta, CEO there is Mark Zuckerberg. What's the power there? It's the data that they collect from their users. Amazon, the data, right? It's a fantastic platform, but of course also, data about their customers, knowing that what I'm probably going to buy next, given what I just bought, given my propensities. And of course, artificial intelligence will feed into that, give us more precision about what I'm probably going to buy next. 67% said, giving us ability to predict events, maintenance quality issues. No, so I should say, let me break that up. Maintenance and quality issues, employee behaviors. But that's interesting. You can predict employee behaviors. That's an interesting one. So I don't know what that means, but it sounds ominous, actually. Giving us the ability to predict customer behaviors. Well, that sounds more benign. It has automated some repetitive tasks, 51%, and 6% say, at least with responding to this particular question, we are not using AI or ML, 6%. Who are you, 1/16 of people? And are you missing something? And maybe, again, the answer might be, no, you're not missing something. So what is the outlook, therefore? And we asked forward-looking questions as well in the survey to get a sense of what's not just happened in 2022. I mean, my goodness, we're in June of 2023. So, okay, 2022 is important, but we want to think about 2023 and beyond, obviously. And so that's what this part of the presentation gets at. Expansion expectations. Again, from the Citrin Cooperman Manufacturing and Distribution Pulse Survey. Which of the following, if any, do you anticipate occurring for your business over the next 3 years? Well, that's a pretty lengthy outlook period, 3 years. Significant increase in workforce, 63%. And I suspect that this is part of the reshoring effort. More supply chains coming back to America. We need workers. And so even though we talk about workers being displaced by robotics and artificial intelligence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, a lot of you plan a significant increase in your workforce. Capital investments involving improvements, buildings, and equipment exceeding $500,000, 49%. Big, chunky investments. Planned, again, part of the reshoring, and of course, to work that associated equipment and work in that in those factories, so on and so forth, those facilities need more workers. So all that fits together. But the point is, it's very upbeat. A potential expansion of the business into a new facility or plant, 48%. Yeah. Expansion. Significant decrease in the workforce, only 22%. Some of that. Reduction of office space, 19%. Well, that makes sense too. In the environment, an environment associated with more pervasive remote work. But nonetheless, I mean, generally speaking, if you're an American who wants to see more manufacturing in America, this is all very good news. Of course, there are, that said, some hurdles to reshoring. So if you look at the graphical element, the right-hand side of the slide here, which of the following do you feel are hurdles to reshoring? So the gold-colored bars there are 2022, the green-colored bars are 2023. Cost of U.S. labor, workers are more expensive. And I every once in a while I'll take an Uber or a Lyft, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you take an Uber or a Lyft, you're rating the driver, 4 stars, 5 stars, whatever, but they're rating you. Do you realize that they're rating you? And I, as it turns out, have a very poor Uber and Lyft passenger rating. It's very poor, and that's because I take an opportunity in every Lyft or Uber I get into to interview an American. And I'll ask them questions like, how much are you making? How many rides do you give a day? How do you take advantage of surge pricing? How much did you pay for this vehicle? Is it yours? That kind of thing. And apparently this is off-putting. I don't know why. But in any case, they could make so much money, when they tell me, driving Uber or Lyft. And so, it's that kind of opportunity, that gig economy, whatever you want to call it, that has taken people out of the traditional employment sectors in many cases and allowed them to still make a living. And already we have decreased labor force participation rate, lack of immigration, legal immigration, I should say, and low birth rates. All of this has conspired to cause some real shortages of labor. In my region of the country, Baltimore, our unemployment rate is 1.9%. I mean, you cannot grow an economy if there's almost no one left to hire. And that drives up cost, obviously. So cost of labor, a big hurdle to reshoring, because we don't see these same kinds of phenomena, let's say in Vietnam, India, some of these other markets where the population is a bit younger. Lack of access to skilled labor, 51%. So it's not just about the number of people, it's about what skills are embodied by them. And as you know, a lot of Americans don't look for opportunities in the production industries. or the logistical sectors of the economy. And so, again, lack of talent, high costs. Of course, there are those capital investment costs, 48% in the 2023 survey. And sometimes, reshoring means giving up some invest capital that, whether in China or elsewhere. It's not just taking on new costs here in the United States or North America generally. Lack of meaningful tax incentives. Oh, that's interesting, right? Because what we saw in August of 2022 was that President Biden signed both the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act is named Inflation Reduction Act, of course, but it was largely an alternative energy kind of package. That's where a lot of the focus was in that package, inputs to alternative energy generation. And so if you take away some of these tax incentives coming from some of these prior pieces of legislation, you're going to have more of a hurdle to reshoring because you've got these constraints with respect to human capital and, of course, the cost of investment in physical facilities. So keys to growth. What are your keys to growth over the next few years? For the following list, what are the biggest keys to your future growth strategy? Select your top 2 choices. Number 1, stabilization of supply chain, which is interesting to me because there's only so much of that you can control as a manufacturer or distributor. Because a lot of this is defined by the external world. Now, you can look for other suppliers, that kind of thing. But if a product is not there, whether it's switchgear or generators or whatever it happens to be, it's not there. So, part of this is this really strategy, stabilization of supply chain? I mean, some of this you control, but perhaps not all of it. So it's an interesting response. Utilizing best-in-class technology, 37%. Stable workforce, 31%, right? Because you're trying to get this workforce to work with new technologies, whether AI, machine learning, or whatever it happens to be. You're investing so much in these people, they have the expertise. The last thing you want is for them to leave, especially for a competitor. E-commerce, 27%, because again, we continue to see that push into the e-commerce sales channels. New products, innovation. Clearly, that's a key. What was this week about? It was about a number of things, as shows up, but it was about Apple introducing this, this virtual reality or augmented reality headset. Enter new markets, 20%, mergers acquisitions, 14%. And why mergers acquisitions? Because scale matters, right? There's economies of scale and scope. And, if you're bigger, you have more purchasing power, and that can ultimately drive down the average and marginal cost. Staying competitive. So what does one need to do to stay competitive? So which of the following do you believe is needed now or in the near future to keep your company competitive? The ability to gather and analyze data from suppliers, enterprise resource planning systems to better predict supply chain delays and cost changes, right? ERP systems. Right. So again, it's about supply chain. It's about the cost changes you will face because of these supply chain issues, which again, in many cases, one does not control, at least not completely. The ability to gather and analyze customer data to better predict their behaviors. Oh, that's interesting. That's AI, isn't it? Again, you see AI all over the place here, and data analysis generally. It's about the data. Isn't that interesting? I mean, the first 2 answers don't relate necessarily to your products that you produce, the demand for those products. That's not what the answers are about. You would think that's what the answers would be about, the first couple. Our company currently has the systems in place to keep us competitive, 48%. Okay. And there has been a lot of investment in AI already, that much is clear from the survey. The ability to identify when employees are at risk of leaving my company, 47%. Now, that's a tricky one, I think. Right? You're trying to figure out when are employees about to, or how do you figure that out? And if you're like me, you just, look at their email. But, there might be other mechanisms of which you are aware and of which I am not aware. Stabilization of interest rates, of course. Yeah, cost of capital is high. That's another cost. Stabilization of inflation, 38%. And maybe that relates, again, back to that supply chain, right? Because one of the reasons we have all this inflation is because of the supply chain dynamics. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk about the forecast for the economy, the macroeconomy. I just want to end with that. Again, thanks for sticking around through that early period when we had some technical issues. The National Federation of Independent Business Index of Small Business Optimism. Question: Small Business in America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? In April, only 3% said yes. Akin to what we saw back in 08-09. And again, I have seen in this survey a plentiful amount of optimism expressed regarding the next 3 years, regarding what you experienced in 2022. But for whatever reason, you look at other surveys and they're not nearly as upbeat. And maybe it's because you're Citrin Cooperman stakeholders, that's the source of your success. And I'm going to say that's what it is. But nonetheless, because Citrin Cooperman is my client. But in any case, again, lots of pessimism out there. If I showed you consumer sentiment, you would also see a lot of pessimism out there. Here's something manufacturers have been dealing with: inventories, at least some manufacturers. So this is your business inventory, 3 slices here. You see the slice in the middle? That's your retail inventories. So in general, consumers have been spending pretty aggressively, but they've shifted some of their spending from retailed items to services, as you've probably heard. So retail sales, as an example, fell in November, December of last year. Many retailers came into 2023, therefore, with plentiful inventory. They discounted that merchandise aggressively in January, and consumers, beleaguered by inflation, jumped all over that discounted merchandise. Retail sales soared in January. But then again, February and March, retail sales fell. And retailers are having to increasingly discount merchandise to move it. And you may have heard some sort of negative announcements coming recently from the likes of Home Depot, Macy's, Target even, serving off in the middle market, that discretionary spending, middle part of the market. Again, it may be part of this economic weakness that many economists have been talking about. And so when retailers have to discount merchandise to move it, they order less from the merchant wholesalers, that's your distributors. And you can see those inventories have risen over time. And when merchant wholesalers see their inventories rise, they order less from the manufacturers down below in the light blue. So the merchant wholesalers is up top in the orange, light blue is manufacturers, those inventories are up. And again, the Purchasing Managers Index, which was 56 a year ago, just has fallen to 46.9, less than 50, suggesting that we have over the past year gone from growth in manufacturing to now actually a loss in activity. Now, those measures suggest recession is coming. This one screams it. This is your yield curve. So, you see in the gold segment there, that's the interest rate or the yield on the 1-year Treasury. The green is the yield or the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury. So, this is, again, about U.S. Treasuries. We buy those U.S. Treasuries, and we're effectively lending to the federal government our money. So they're borrowing, we're lending by buying those bonds. Now, typically you'd expect the yield or the interest rate on a 10-year Treasury to be above that on a 1-year Treasury. Why? Because if I'm buying a 10-year Treasury, I'm lending to the federal government for 10 years. I'm not going to see my principal for a decade, and I demand more interest in the interim to reward me for my patience. However, if I buy a 12-month or 1-year Treasury, I'm going to see my principal in 1 year, basically risk-free. Now the debt ceiling is behind us. And so I don't need to be rewarded so handsomely. But occasionally, the bond market goes topsy-turvy, upside down, inside out, Diana Ross. And the gold line, the yield on the 1 year, goes above the green line, the yield on the 10-year. Now, these gray shaded areas are periods of recession dating back several decades. So when do you see this yield curve inversion, this gold line going above the green line? This was before the 1970 recession, before 73, 74, 75, before 1980, before 81, 82, before 1990, 1991, before 2001, before 07, 08, 09, not so much before 2020, that was caused by something else. But now we have massive inversion of the yield curve. As of this morning, the yield on the 1 year is about 149 basis points, or 1.49 percentage points above the yield on the 10-year. And it has been a pretty good predictor of recession for decades. So I know that this survey has been pretty upbeat in the outlook among manufacturers and distributors, but I would say that I think recession is coming. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better economically. And again, a lot of that has to do with these Federal Reserve rate increases and the lag effects built into the economy. So when the Federal Reserve increases interest rates, as they've done for the last 10 meetings, they'll probably pause in June, but this month. But last 10 meetings, they've raised rates. The effect of that doesn't show up immediately in the economy. It can take 12, 14, 18, 24 months for the full effect of an interest rate increase to show up in the economy. So you've got all these lag effects from these past rate increases yet to show up. So I think the economy is going to get worse as it turns out. Now, second quarter GDP might be okay, but I would expect more weakness during the latter half of this year, especially by September, October, November, December. The global economy is weakening, which reinforces our weakness. The national economy is weakening. Borrowing costs are higher and excess inflation persists. And again, some segments are perhaps already in recession. Some segments stand to hold a better than others, include public construction, lots of money is lined up for infrastructure, grocery stores you got to eat, and multifamily housing from the perspective not of the developer community, but from the perspective of those that manage properties, because I think you'll still see a lot of leasing activity there. At some point, the Federal Reserve will stop raising rates, and more importantly, will start cutting them. And that will represent a key inflection point for the economy. But even if they don't raise rates any further, rates are high enough to suppress economic growth. And I don't expect them to start cutting rates until 2024, which will, I think, create for us the next growth cycle. Between now and then, I think a recession begins. So I think recession condition will prevail at some point over the next 12 months. Again, I could be wrong. I am an economist. And so with that, let me stop sharing. And if we have any time for Q&A, again, I know we got off to a late start, but I wanted to get you out as close to noon as possible, Eastern Standard Time. So let me stop sharing, and thanks a lot for listening.
Yeah, thanks again, Doctor. I appreciate everyone hanging on the line while we navigated through these technological issues. For those of you who don't know me, John Giordano, out of the Melville office, national co-practice leader with Mark in the manufacturing distribution space. This is the Q&A portion of it. If anybody wants to hang on, get any questions asked. Before we get into that, thank you again to Dr. Basu. We've been working with since the inception of the survey, and come back year after year by popular demand. As always, you did a great job of taking all the information from our survey and applying it not only to the current economic conditions affecting the companies today, but as well as linking it to forecasting future trends. So I appreciate that a lot. So anybody wants to submit questions, and for those of you that have to drop off, if you want to send an email with any questions you may have to myself or Mark Henry, we will work together behind the scenes to make sure that all your questions do get answered. Again, we apologize again for the technology delays. So Dr. Basu, it looks like we do have one coming in. I'll read it to you. How do you think our relations with China will affect M&D in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think that's part of the reshoring story, John. And I think a lot of this relates not just our relationship with China, but the relationship of the Chinese government to Chinese production and distribution activities. So you might remember with the Communist Congress of the late 1970s through the 80s, that the notion among communist leaders, Deng Xiaoping, that the people of that ilk was maybe the Communist Party does not have to be involved in all things. Maybe we can allow enterprise to flourish in China by not being so involved in their day-to-day activities. And China, as a result, flourished. Their market was able to take off. They became the manufacturing engine and growth engine of the world. Quarter of global manufacturing takes place in China, so on and so forth. A lot of jobs left from America to go to China to take advantage of those efficiencies, to take advantage of that labor force, so on and so forth, less expensive land, all that. But all of a sudden, under the new leadership, the Chinese government is being involved increasingly into day-to-day activity, including business and commerce. And that's making China, I think, much less competitive. And you can see that not just in terms of reshoring to the United States, you can see that in terms of reshoring to Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, for instance, where Apple is starting to make iPhones, that kind of thing. So I think you'll see more reshoring to America because China has become a less advantageous place in which to manufacture. And there's obviously lots of tax incentives, at least in place right now, to help smooth that reshoring financially. So our relationship with China is part of the story, but it's also a relationship with the Communist Party to their economy that's going to drive more activity back to the United States and to North America generally.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We have another couple trickling in here. So how will these higher interest rates affect investment in new technologies for the sector?
Yeah, so obviously when you've got higher cost of capital, higher cost of borrowing, that would tend to depress or suppress investment in new equipment, new technologies, even new people, as it turns out. I mean, that's what higher interest rates are designed to do. Why has the Federal Reserve been raising interest rates? Is to quash demand growth, to bring demand into conformity with supply so that excess inflation abates. That's the reason. I mean, this is engineered. So obviously with these higher costs of capital, one might say, look, let me wait for interest rates to start falling. Economists are saying, some economists at least, that interest rates start falling maybe in 2024. And if that's the case, why not borrow then with a lower rate of interest and buy that piece of equipment then? And so in the near term, that suppresses investment. And indeed, there is actually a measure, John, in the gross domestic product data, which is called non-residential fixed investment in equipment. And wouldn't you know it, for the last 2 quarters for which you have data, equipment purchases in America have fallen. And that, I think, has a lot to do with that rising cost of capital. And so, when interest rates start to fall, what would you expect to see? A resurgence in investment in equipment.
Appreciate it. Couple more here. So these both kind of tie into the same topic, so I'll try and ask them together. Throughout our survey, obviously, we discussed a lot about AI, data analytics, and that being a core focus of many businesses. So the first part of it is, how do you expect AI to continue to influence manufacturing distributors in the future? And I guess the second piece will be, if companies are not investing in AI, will they survive? Will they be left behind?
Yeah, these are great questions, of course. So let me take that first one first. Look, I think this is about process innovation more than anything else, right? That yes, you can use AI for all kinds of purposes, but it's about how can we move as far down the average cost curve as is possible? How can we be as efficient as is possible? And AI knows the answers to that, presumably. And so I expect to, in terms of influencing manufacturers and distributors, it gets to optimal inventory management. It gets to, figuring out how the machine should tie together, when there should be an upgrade in some category of machinery, that kind of thing. AI will provide those kinds of answers in many cases. How do I optimize? And so, that relates to the question, for companies not investing in AI, will they survive? Well, it depends on who they are. I can imagine that if you're a sufficiently specialized manufacturer, you're not using AI, but what you produce is so rare, so hard to find, so specialized, so unique to you, that yeah, you can survive. Because if people need to find that product, that input or that output, they're going to turn to you. You survive. But I suspect that in a world in which manufacturers are going to get bigger through mergers and acquisitions, where there are going to be economies of scale and scope reaped by artificial intelligence, that the firms that are at the back edge of that technological revolution, and they're saying that AI is going to be as important to our lives as the internet has been. So if that's the case, my guess is that firms on the back end of that innovation spectrum are going to lose market share. And by the way, that's one of the things that's going to drive mergers and acquisitions going forward, is because people want the best technology, the best people, and that costs money. And that means, firms that are bigger and have that kind of balance sheet are more likely to make those technological advances and shifts.
Thank you. This guy, Mr. Anonymous Attendee, has a lot of questions today. What do you think will happen with the research and development? This is a good one. I'm interested to hear what you think on this one. What do you think will happen with the research and development fiscal policy? Have you heard any positive movement in the additional incentives put in place?
Okay, John, somehow I lost can you hear me still, John?
I can hear you. Yeah, I'll read it, no problem.
Yeah, no, I'll read it. I can read it myself. What do you think will happen with research and development fiscal policy? Have you heard any positive momentum and additional incentives put in place? Look, I think that this is one of the things that unifies Republicans and Democrats. So we're talking about federal fiscal policy, and of course, states have their own policy. States can also offer pretty generous tax incentives, and I suspect many will, with respect to bringing manufacturing back to the United States. So it's not just a federal issue, but if we're focused on federal policy, this reshoring is very exciting to both Republicans and Democrats, and it cuts across the political spectrum. So yes, we see in states like Arizona and Texas, for instance, a lot of reshoring activity, but we also see computer chip manufacturing plants being developed in Ohio, Syracuse, New York, Boise, Idaho, all over the country. We see battery manufacturing plants in places like Michigan, but also in Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky. So this is one thing that unites the country, unites the politicians. And so I suspect that given that they don't want to stop this reshoring movement from transpiring, that they're going to continue to be quite generous tax incentives for reshoring and more supply chaining in America. That's a prediction. Obviously, we're still dealing with this $32 trillion national debt. We just came through this debt ceiling issue. So there are those issues. But with respect to tax credits for people who are producing items, I think they can be justified saying that, yeah, we're giving them a tax benefit, but then we're getting more in terms of income tax collections and other tax collections as the federal government. And so it's really not costing us that much, if anything.
Yeah, I think that actually addresses the next question also, which was towards tax credits. So I'm not sure if anybody else has any other questions. We're, again, a few minutes past the hour, so If not, we'll start to wrap up. And like I said before, if anybody does have any questions that we did not get to, if anybody else has any questions that we did not get to, and would like Dr. Basu's take on it, please email myself or Mark Henry. We'll get those questions answered for you. Mark, any closing comments?
No, I just want to thank you, Dr. Basu, for your time. Your insights are always fantastic, and I know everyone gets a good laugh out of all the kind of the jokes you throw in along the way. So appreciate your time, and thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mark. And I don't remember making any jokes, but thank you in any case. And 50 minutes ago, I didn't think this was even going to happen. So I'm so glad that we got the technology worked out and we did this. Thank you very much. Be well, everyone.